Okay, welcome back. This is probably the last video I'll bore you with this semester, and we're going to do a little test here. We're going to compare a live version with something I will record using some AI-based technology, and we'll see how that compares and how it turns out and what you all think of it. The point of the video, since it does have a point, is to just cover a last couple of bits of content that I think are relevant for the course itself, kind of wrap things up and hopefully tie some knots together that we might not have time to really cover properly in the course, of the discussion sessions and the previous videos. And of course, it has to do with the electrophysiology, the membrane, the way we can use the tools we've learned throughout the semester to actually calculate the resting potential. And by extension, we can also use this in the future to calculate action potentials and to come up with models that describe them. Now, the basic ideas hopefully are very clear by now. We have a set of ions. Each one of those ions has its own protein structure, has its own behavior, has its own Nernst potential, which is a function of the concentration of ions and their gradient across the membrane. That gives us the batteries that make up our circuit. We also have a capacitance, which we've talked about extensively. That's the behavior of the bilipid layer itself. That's a dielectric medium, and we can replace that in our schematic with a capacitance. And we even have some pretty good estimates of how big that capacitance is, and you've used that in one of your homework assignments. So the net result is a circuit that we can analyze. And the question is, how do we go about doing that practically? So the circuit is something like what you see in this image. This one still contains the chloride ion channel, which, as we've discussed, is not really a player in determining resting potential, so we can kind of get rid of that and simplify things down. After this, we really fall back on the tricks or the techniques that we've been using all semester, and I'll just quickly go through this. And so the first step we do, of course, is to say at rest, the voltage across the membrane voltage is constant, and so the capacitance doesn't contribute anything more to the resting potential. The potential on the capacitance matches the potential on the membrane, and since that is constant, that's how we define resting conditions, then we can remove that from our calculations. We don't even need to know that at this point. We can also remove the chloride, and that gives us an even simpler circuit with just the sodium and the potassium, and that's really all we have to solve. Now, this will not surprise you, I hope, that the way we solve this is by using Kirchhoff-Tuors. And here you can see a picture of one set of Kirchhoff-Tuors. As usual, there are multiple ways to solve this problem. But you can see in this diagram, I've defined two Kirchhoff-Tuors. I've defined a current that we have to figure out. And we can just march through the calculation pretty quickly. Here's the result of Kirchhoff-Tuor analysis for the first Kirchhoff-Tuor. From that, I can compute the current I, which of course only flows to the left-hand loop of the circuit. The right-hand loop is an open circuit, and the reason it's an open circuit is because we're going to use a Thevenin equivalent circuit. So all we have to compute now is the open circuit voltage under these conditions. So the right hand, the resting potential VR, is under the conditions of an open circuit, and that simplifies our lives. We now take that current, feed it into the Kirchhoff-Tuor equation, and then we get the actual resting potential of minus 67 in this case. And it obviously consists of something like a weighted sum or average of the two potentials of the various ions, two Nernst potentials of the two different ion types. And you can see that in the equation, the way it has the VK term and the VNA term, and the resistances are what provide the weighting for it. So that's how we can compute our resting potential. It's quite simple here. One of the points we did discuss briefly in the discussion sessions this week that I want to reinforce is this question of where the ions go in our their ion movements during this resting phase. So how resting is resting? Resting simply means the potential is constant, but does it also mean that no current flows? And if we think about what's going on here, the amount of current flow is dictated by Ohm's law, of course. And it has to do with the difference between the membrane potential and the Nernst potential. So now if we look at this diagram here I've included both the potassium and sodium arms of the circuit. And there you can see there's a VK and a VNA. And there's a voltage difference between VR, which we just computed as minus 67, and both of those Nernst potentials. And as long as there's a difference between that membrane potential and the Nernst potential, then there's a voltage difference across the respective resistances. And if there's a voltage difference across the resistance that is not infinite, then we will have a current flow. Again, it's Ohm's law. Ohm's law explains everything relevant in our lives, right? So we can qualitatively quickly see that indeed there will be current flowing. And the question then becomes what happens over time? As this circuit runs along and the current keeps draining, the sodium ions keep moving into the cell and the potassium ions keep moving out of the cell. How can that go on forever? Because eventually the concentration gradients will change. And if the concentration gradients change, then the Nernst potentials change. And if the Nernst potentials change, then that voltage difference changes between the Nernst potentials and the membrane potential, and that will affect the current flow. And that is indeed what happens, just very similarly to the way a battery runs down over time when we plug it into a circuit and use it to drive some device. So what happens here? What saves our day? Of course, you all know it's the sodium-potassium pump. It's a pump because it consumes energy, and this is where the energy comes into the system, and that pump pushes those ions against their concentration gradient and maintains, and there's some very cool physiology here, it maintains the voltage through the concentration gradient. So its driver, if you will, is that concentration gradient, and if that concentration gradient is maintained in a stable level, then so is the Nernst potential. And if that's the case, the battery will keep on running. Energy, ATP, will have to be consumed by that pump, and life will go on and everything will function normally. So that's really, the core ideas that, we talked about, just kind of summarized briefly here to remind you all. Now, one thing we didn't talk about, I'll just touch on briefly, is these circuits can be reduced. This is where Thevenin comes in. These circuits can be reduced to a much simpler form that allows us to now calculate their behavior, because we have learned throughout the semester how to calculate the behavior of simple RC circuits. And we can reduce the actual circuit down to a simplified form using the Thevenin equivalence. So in this case, we look at this diagram again. This is now with everything back in place, the chloride current, the capacitor across the membrane, and now Vm is just the generic membrane voltage. And we can use the Thevenin simplification to convert that into a much simpler circuit by defining the capacitance as the load and kind of breaking the circuit there. And then everything on the other side of the capacitance is what we can simplify using Thevenin equivalent circuits. And of course, to do that, we remove, first of all, to get the Thevenin resistance, we remove all the voltage sources, replace them with a short circuit, and we compute the resistance that the circuit would have with those three parallel resistors now just left over. And of course, that's very simple. We take the inverse of each of those resistances, add them together, take the inverse of the result, and we end up with a Thevenin equivalent resistance. We can also do the same thing to calculate the Thevenin voltage. And that again, we can recognize that we've really done previously. So that resting potential, at least under resting conditions, that's the Thevenin voltage that we have. And so now we have a Thevenin voltage, a Thevenin resistance, and we can compute the circuit. But more importantly, we can reconnect the capacitance, and that circuit now looks like a voltage source connected to an RC circuit. And we've measured these in the lab. We've written down the expressions for the voltages that arise across that capacitance. That's the membrane voltage. So we now can even make changes in the circuit. And this is the bridge to go from the resting situation into the action potentials. And that chapter you'll be hearing in future classes. And I hope you'll keep these basic ideas in mind even as you move into the more complex situation of an action potential where the resistance is not constant and hence the time constant changes. All kinds of wonderful changes that come about and interesting topics, at least I find them interesting, that explain how action potentials work and allow us, and this is important as engineers, to actually compute them, to create models, to describe their behavior under all kinds of conditions. And that's a whole big world of electrophysiology that you may explore at some time. So final things I want to say is sort of what's next after this course is over. We have other physics-based courses that will fit into your core requirements. Biosignals is a natural one. That's one that some of you will be taking next semester already. And that very much builds on the chapters that we had dedicated to signals and Fourier decompositions and even some sampling and you know, all those sort of topics. They'll expand greatly, of course, over the course of the semester, and you'll hopefully learn to appreciate signals and some of their richness. We'll also have, of course, in systems. So there's a biosystems class, which returns you to circuits and actually measurement topics. Again, we've sort of pinged just gently. Those will all come back and you'll build on those when you think about how to create sensing circuits of some complexity, and that will flesh out that side of things. And then of course you'll have in your junior year a course in physiology and a course in biomechanics, and those both very directly build on some of the topics that we've covered in this class. So I hope we've prepared you for those and that you remember some of this content or review some of this content when you're faced with these and more advanced classes in these topics. Of course, there are also elective classes in our program that dive into any of the number of these directions, from deeper analysis of the electrophysiology to the biomechanics and the electrical circuits and you know all these things. So there's lots of places to take this content and go with it, you know, wherever your ambitions and your interest lies, and that's really the purpose of our program in a nutshell, is to give you that opportunity. Finally, I want to wish you good luck in your exams. I'm optimistic. I hope you're prepared well. I hope you reach out if you have questions. That's what we're here to answer. You've been an awesome class. I've really enjoyed getting to know all of you a little bit, some of you, of course, more than others. And I hope this is just the beginning of a relationship that we have with you in the program, and that we welcome you back in subsequent classes and then get to continue this relationship and helping each other out and learning from each other as you go through the program and as we go through the learning that we do. So thanks so much for all your attention, all your kind words this semester, and just for your engagement. That's the most important thing, and I think you've been fantastic. So bye for now. Look forward to talking to you again soon.